The season of Lent is a time to be honest with ourselves. The season of Lent is a time to confess our sinfulness, our shortcomings, our failures. And you've heard me say many times from this pulpit, if you've been here during these last 6 months, that the church has a problem, especially the North American church. And I think I'm allowed to say with my accent, especially the North American church in the South. We have a problem. You've heard me say that the church, for whatever reason, does not look like the embodiment of Christ in this world. We do not look like people who have made the decision to deny ourselves, to pick up a cross, and to follow Jesus, wherever Jesus leads us, which is doing the same things that Jesus did when he was on this earth, going to the same places that he went, loving the same people he loved, loving the same way that he loved, generously, graciously. So why don't we look like Jesus? Why does the church, in the South especially, in our country, fail to look like we're living for Jesus? Well, I hear people make all kinds of excuses as a pastor. You know, I'll give them a challenge to make a commitment to be the hands and feet of Christ in this world. And they'll say things to me like, well, preacher, I just don't know if I'm ready for that. I got some things in my life that I need to work out first. I have some doubts. I still have a lot of questions. I have so much to learn. I have so much to figure out. And you know, preacher, I got some personal issues. I got some personal issues that I've got to deal with. I have this problem, not a lot of people know it, but I've got this problem with anger. Sometimes I act before I speak, or I act before I think. I speak before I think. So right now, preacher, if you don't mind, until I can get my act together, let me just sit on my pew and just listen some more. Let me sing some more. Let me pray some more. And then maybe one day, I'll make this decision to deny myself, to pick up a cross, to follow Jesus. But right now, I think I'm going to pass on that. And I'm just going to believe in Jesus. I'm not going to follow Jesus. And that's a problem. It's a big problem that we have in North America. We don't look like people who have decided to follow Jesus. Well, here's my response to people who have all those excuses. Have you ever met Peter? Have you ever met Simon Peter? You know, St. Peter, the one Jesus called a rock and said, on this rock I will build my church. The one Roman Catholics recognize as the first pope. Perhaps you've heard of St. Peter's Square, St. Peter's Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica. Peter, the one whom Jesus loved and trusted to follow in his steps in this world, to continue his mission in this world. You may think to yourself, you know, there's no way I'm ready to be like Peter. I got some things to work out first. I've got some doubts. I can't do that. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about this Peter fellow. One day, Peter's out on a boat with other disciples. It's in the middle of the night, and a storm is raging. The wind is howling. The waves are crashing into the boat. And as you could imagine, they were all scared to death. But then Jesus comes to them, walking on the water, saying to them, have courage. Do not be afraid. But Peter has some doubts. Peter's got some questions. Peter needs to work some things out. Lord, if it is really you, because I'm not sure if it is, if it's really you, then command me to come out on the water. And Jesus responds, Peter, you of little faith. I know y'all might think, oh, I thought he Jesus said that after he walked on the water and sank. Now, Peter had no business walking on the water. We can't walk on water. Only Jesus can walk on water. Peter had no business getting out of the boat. He should have stayed in the boat and trusted in Jesus, but he didn't. He doubted. Lord, if it is you. Peter, you have little faith. Later, Jesus is instructing Peter about discipleship. Jesus talks about being humble. Jesus talks about lowering oneself, pouring oneself out. Jesus talks about selfless, self-expending, sacrificial love, being with and for the least of these. But Peter's got some issues. Peter has got some things to learn. Peter gets into an argument with the other disciples about which one of them is going to be the greatest. After Jesus prays in the garden, surrendering himself to the will of God, offering himself as a sacrifice, Jesus does not resist arrest, but practices what he preaches and turns the other cheek. But Peter loses it. Peter acts before he thinks. In a fit of anger, Peter fights back. Peter draws his sword and begins swinging it at Jesus' captors, cutting off the ear of one. And in our text this morning, Jesus foretells that garden event. He talks about being rejected by organized religion. He talks about being arrested. He talks about being crucified. Jesus is essentially saying, when you preach the Word of God that cuts like a sword, when you love all people and you try to teach others to love all people, and love means all, with a love that is unconditional, a grace that is extravagant, when you talk about the need to make room at the table for all, when you stand up for the rights of the poor and the marginalized, when you proclaim liberty to the oppressed and you say that their lives matter, when you defend, forgive, and friend sinners caught in the very act of sinning, when you tell lovers of money to sell their possessions and give everything to the poor, when you command a culture of war to be peacemakers, when you tell the powerful to turn the other cheek, when you call the religious leaders hypocrites and you point out their hypocrisy, when you criticize their faith without works, their theology without practice, their tithing without justice, when you refuse to tolerate, when you refuse not to tolerate intolerance, when you do these things that I do, says Jesus, then the self-righteous powers that be, they're coming for you. They will rise up and they will hate, and they will come against you with all that they have, and they will come against you in the name of God. They will do anything and everything in their power to stop you, even if it means killing you. But Peter's got some issues with that. Peter's got a problem. Peter says, "No way, Jesus, stop talking like that. This is not right. You're crazy. We will not let this happen." Then, having about all that Jesus could possibly stand of Peter and his nonsense and his excuses, his doubts, his questioning, his anger, his lack of faith, his personal issues, all the mess in his life that he needs to work out, Jesus responds to Peter with some of the harshest words found in the entire Bible. "Get behind me, Satan." Get behind me, Satan. Jesus calls Peter Satan. And yet, that did not stop Jesus from loving Peter, from using Peter. Jesus kept teaching Peter. Jesus kept calling Peter, kept leading Peter to do his work in this world, to be the hands and feet of Christ in this world. In fact, it did not stop Jesus from calling Peter to start his church in this world. So if you feel like that you don't have what it takes to follow Jesus, and if your excuses are that you have some doubts, or you have questions, or you're just not ready, you've got some issues to work out, you feel unworthy, you've got some anger management skills that you need to work out. Even if you have days that you know that you resemble Satan more than you resemble God, then you're going to have to come up with another excuse. Because as Peter teaches us, with Jesus, those excuses simply do not fly. So what's really keeping us from following Jesus? Why is the church today in North America in so much trouble? After Jesus is arrested, Peter goes into the courtyard of the high priest. It's a cold night, so he gathers with some folks who had started a fire to warm themselves. A servant girl begins staring at Peter and says, that man was with Jesus. He traveled all around with him, doing the things that Jesus did, saying the things that Jesus said, loving the people that Jesus loved. But Peter denied it, saying, woman, I don't even know this Jesus. A little later, another saw him and said, you are a disciple of Jesus who defended, forgave, and friended sinners. Even that one that y'all caught in the act of sinning. You welcomed strangers, you visited prisoners, you clothed the naked, you gave water to the thirsty, you fed the hungry, you restored lepers, you elevated the status of women, you gave dignity to eunuchs, you offered community to lepers. But again, Peter denied it. About an hour had passed, and another man began to insist, saying, certainly this man was with him, for he is a Galilean too. You called out hypocrisy on the behalf of widows. You challenged the status quo on the behalf of the sick. You disobeyed the laws of God on the behalf of the suffering. But Peter said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Peter's denials had nothing to do with a lack of faith. Peter's denials, his refusal to take up his cross, his failure to follow Jesus in the selfless, sacrificial way of Jesus, had nothing to do with his doubts and his questions, his personal issues, his poor anger management, because as Jesus pointed out over and over, those excuses simply don't cut it. Peter's failure to follow Jesus was shame. Shame. Peter had trouble following Jesus because he was ashamed of the gospel of Jesus. He was ashamed of what the gospel stood for and for whom the gospel stood. Which raises the question, could this be our problem? Could this be why the church does not look like Jesus in 2018 in North America, especially here in the South? Could this be our failure to follow in the way of Jesus? Peter was ashamed to love because living among voices clamoring to take their country back from foreign invaders, it was more popular to hate. Peter was ashamed to identify with the least because it was more popular to identify with the greatest. Peter was ashamed to be last because it was more popular to be first. Jesus was ashamed to tell the truth because it was more popular to embrace a lie. Peter was ashamed to embrace the way of humility because it was more popular to be arrogant and boastful, proud, condescending, self-important. Peter was ashamed to share his wealth because it was more popular to hold on to it. Peter was ashamed to side with the poor because it was more popular to call them lazy. Peter was ashamed to include foreigners because it was more popular to dehumanize them by calling them snakes. Peter was ashamed to defend and forgive sinners because it was more popular to throw rocks. Peter was ashamed to welcome and elevate the status of children because it was more popular to put them down. Jesus was ashamed to visit prisoners because it was more popular to treat them like the animals most folks thought they were. Peter was ashamed to stand up for the marginalized because it was more popular to call them abominations. Jesus was ashamed to respect women as equals because it was more popular to treat them like objects. Peter was ashamed to turn the other cheek because it was more popular to draw a sword. Peter was ashamed to pick up and carry a cross because it was more popular to pick up and carry a weapon of war. And Jesus said, "Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." We started this service by singing, "I have decided to follow Jesus." The question is, are we really ready to follow Jesus? Are we ready to give sacrificially? Are we ready to serve graciously? If not, what's our excuse? We must remember with Jesus a lack of faith, having a lot of questions, having a lot of doubts, having some serious issues, or not having ourselves all together simply does not cut it. Could our excuse be that we're just ashamed? Are we ashamed of the gospel? Are we ashamed of what the gospel stands for and for whom it stands? The good news is, Peter dealt with his shame. Peter repented. And this one Jesus called Satan helped to start the church and has been named by the church as its first pope. The good news is for us this morning is that we still have time to deal with our shame. Let us pray together. Oh God, help us to deal with our shame and openly commit ourselves to following the way of Christ, His gospel, His mission in this world. Help us to pick up our crosses and courageously follow Christ unreservedly, confidently, and unashamedly, wherever He leads. Amen. We gather every Sunday morning to worship around a table. We gather to share a holy meal to which Christ has invited us. And He has invited us in spite of all of our shortcomings. You've got a place at this table. I've got a place at this table. All who have gathered here this morning, you have a place at this table. We'll feast together, united by the love of Christ. We'll find our place together, led by the grace of Christ. We'll find our home together, enveloped by the mercy of Christ. And we'll be called to serve together, to be the hands and the feet of Christ together, led by the Spirit of Christ. So welcome again to First Christian Church. Welcome to the table. Let us now prepare to share this holy meal as we remain seated and sing together.